tomorrow. See if I can get them behind a podium with the top scientists of this country, and maybe we'll have a shot. So I thought to myself, well, who's the most, well, there's at the time he was alive, Senator Ted Kennedy. His son, he might be interested. And of course, his son is now a New Jersey resident, as you all know, in Brigantine. Patrick Kennedy, former congressman from Rhode Island. He married a woman from New Jersey. And I said, all right, well, let me talk to Patrick, because Congressman Kennedy has dedicated his life to mental health. And so we talked about it, and he was completely on board. And then I said, I need to find the most conservative person I know. Dick Cheney wouldn't return my calls, unfortunately. He was a little busy. Don Rumsfeld wouldn't return my calls. I think he was writing a book. So I kind of went for the next tier down. And I said, well, who came up with the idea axis of evil? You remember that phrase from George Bush. I mean, that person's probably got to be pretty conservative, right? So I found the writer of Axis of Evil. He's actually a brilliant conservative intellectual named David Frum. And I said to him, would you be interested? And he was kind of like, well, this isn't really an issue I follow, and I'm not sure. And then I said, well, I'm going to be on MSNBC tomorrow for half an hour. They're giving me half an hour, which was shocking. Now, mind you, it was Sunday morning at 5:45 in the morning they were giving, but it's okay, something. If you don't mind, DVR it, and then call me later if you like what you see. And as soon as I was done at 6:15, I was taken from the studio from 30 Rock. He called me at 6:15 and said, sign me up. So there we had the most liberal, the most conservative person I could find. And then I called the medical groups, and they said, oh, yeah, we're already on board. We wrote a position paper in 2009, and we wrote something that's a 700-page monograph in 2011. And I said, with all due respect, doctors, has anyone other than the 6 people on your committee ever read that? I mean, nobody knows about it. And yet legalization groups are out there left and right getting their, marijuana is safer than alcohol. Let's get rid of the drug war. Those messages out as opposed to the science. And so they agreed. And so we started this coalition called SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, where we don't look at this as a black and white issue. We absolutely think that, and we're a nonprofit, we absolutely think that there's been this false dichotomy of legalization or prohibition, and we absolutely think that we need to reform the criminal justice system too. So just because you're against legalization, see, it used to be, if you were against legalization, you thought everything in the criminal justice system was hunky-dory, was perfect. And I've never met a prosecutor, I've never met some probation officer, I've never met a chief of police, I never met a cop on the beat, let alone a community member that thought everything was perfect with our criminal justice system. In fact, we should say one thing. We do have a mental health system in this country, and it's called the criminal justice system, right? I mean, that's part of the problem. And so we absolutely need to have some reforms, and we might discuss what those are. I personally don't think that people with low-level amounts should be, going to jail. I don't think that a 17-year-old kid with a joint in his pocket should have a criminal record that follows him around so that when he's 35 and looking for a job, he can't get one. So I do think there are things we can do. So, and by the way, New Jersey has a very good, I would almost call it model law, where they do a record expungement if you've gone through a treatment program, things like that we need to absolutely promote. But I'm telling you this in the beginning because, it's important that we emphasize this, but and say that just because we want some reform, legalization is not equal to reform, and that's what's unfortunately been the mantra. That if you were either prohibition or legalization, and so we've come out to try and change that. Let me tell you what legalization really is about, folks. It's about this. And I'll tell you what this is. This is a small picture, but it's not about emptying the prisons. It's not about the criminal justice system. It's not about civil rights and allowing someone to enjoy marijuana even. It is about money. That is all that it is about. And people are surprised when I will talk about the harms of marijuana. It's the first myth in my book. I'm going to go into detail about it. But they're surprised that I don't just come out here and say, well, marijuana's the worst thing ever and don't use it and it's horrible and that's why we shouldn't legalize. That is a reason we shouldn't legalize, that it's absolutely can be harmful for people. But the way I want some people to really understand it is that we spent 100 years with the lies and deceit of the tobacco industry, right? An industry that told us as late as 1999 that they weren't sure if tobacco was addictive, right? 500,000 people dead a year. Well, we're not sure. We have this study. We have that study. We spent 100 years hearing from the tobacco industry, oh, those candy cigarettes we're selling? That's actually aimed for the 45-year-old adult, because everybody wants to, every adult wants a candy cigarette. Trust us, that's not aimed at kids. Don't take our word for it. We even heard in their private documents, which, as you know, those documents have been released by the government. So we now have millions of private memos from the tobacco executives amongst themselves that they didn't know that anyone would ever hear. So when we read through those, we see things like they joke about whether they smoke themselves. And the head of R.J. Reynolds, who's worth like $10 billion, he says, "Oh no, I don't touch that expletive. I don't smoke that. We reserve that right," he said. "We reserve that right of smoking for the young, the poor, the black, and the stupid." And that's literally what they said when they thought no one was listening. So we had that industry for about a century. We still do, although we've made some progress. The idea that we want to roll out the red carpet for another similar industry, and actually an industry that's peddling something that's, in a sense, for society, has much more societal impact than tobacco. Let me give you an example. Have you ever heard of a tobacco-related car accident? Have you heard of a tobacco-related, attention deficit? Tobacco-related mental illness? No, because I'll talk about it in a minute. Different drugs work on the brain in different ways, and as bad as tobacco is in terms of emphysema and COPD and lung cancer, it doesn't intoxicate you. And so we're now taking a drug that is not only smoke, so you have all the bad things that have to do with smoking, you now almost have the worst parts of another legal drug that we're trying to deal with, alcohol. And if I have to hear from one more person that, well, what drug is safer and why is alcohol legal and not? Folks, alcohol is legal for one reason, and it's not because it's safe. Alcohol is legal because it's been in Western culture since before the Old Testament, right? 5,000 years, it's been a mainstream part of our culture, at least 70% of Western culture consuming alcohol. So when you try and prohibit that, it's difficult to do when 70% of people are doing it. And, for a young person, though, when I have to hear someone saying, well, I'd rather them smoke marijuana than drink, folks, that's like saying I'd rather them jump out of the 4th floor window than the 8th floor window. It just doesn't make any sense. We don't want them to do either one. And so we have this false equivalency that people say, well, I mean, alcohol's legal, Kevin. And the issue is kind of like two wrongs don't make a right. Doesn't mean we want to prohibit alcohol. We can't, because 70% of people use it. It's part of our culture. That's not going to happen. But the idea that we want to take a drug that less than 10% of Americans use, I mean, I understand the idea that we're kind of going against the tide for legalization. I get it. But at the end of the day, folks, less than 10% of us use it on a monthly basis. This is not, if we were talking about a drug used by 70% of people regularly, we might have to have a different conversation, because if it would be all around us, we'd have to say, well, we have to figure out how to regulate it. Folks, this is now used by less than 10%. Oops. So the idea that we want to kind of expand that, I don't understand. But anyway, it really is about this, and I'm going to talk about this. Here's the percentage of drugs that we use on a regular basis: alcohol, marijuana, and cigarettes. I got to say, on the cigarette number of 26%, I don't know about you, but that means 1 in 4 Americans still use tobacco. I don't even know where you can smoke these days. Can anyone tell me? If you smoke in your car, you can't ever sell it to anyone, including a smoker, because smokers don't even want to buy cars that have been owned by smokers. That's true. If you try and use it at home, I'll tell you, your spouse or kids or significant other will, if they don't use, they will kick you out of the house as fast as anything, because you're going to stink up the whole house and the carpet and the clothes and everything. So, even though we've pushed back so much on cigarettes, folks, it is legal. We're still living off of this. We have a legacy of this industry that lied about it and told us it was safe for over a century. Well, we have 1 in 4 people using it still. I don't know what argument we could use to say, alcohol, we need more people using intoxicants in our country. We need more. Let's increase that number for marijuana. Do you think that, law enforcement are saying to themselves, man, if only more people were drunk, our jobs would be easier? Or teachers, if only more kids came to school intoxicated, that would really help us out. Think about it. I will give you all the stats. You can read it in the book. It comes down to this. Do you think that more marijuana is good for your community? That's really what it comes down to. Do you think more of it is good for your kids' learning? Is more of it good for Main Street? Do you want a pot shop on Main Street? Is that good for the economy? Is more of it good for our mental health crisis in this country? Is more of it good for road safety? And the answer is very plain and simple. It's very clear about where to be on marijuana. It's not even a contest. But when we start thinking about, well, there are a lot of people in prison, and so maybe we could empty it because we could legalize and we could get tax revenue, that's where it gets, we get diverted. Absolutely, we should reform the criminal justice system. Absolutely, we need a much better community correction system in this country. We need to reform some of the harsh laws. We need to look at what is causing the fact that there are, if you're a marginalized population, you're more likely to go to prison. Absolutely, let's look into that. But let me tell you something about marginalized populations. And you can tell me if Camden or Newark is different. I just know the stats from D.C., Baltimore, Detroit, and Los Angeles and Houston. So you tell me if it's different here. But you want to talk about marginalized communities. There are about 8 times as many liquor stores in poorer communities in this country than there are. And when I go down to Baltimore, I can find a liquor store, payday cash, lottery, maybe a Chinese takeout, and maybe a church on the same area. I can't find a grocery store or a school that's been renovated this century, or a grocery store even, for 10 miles. But I can find all the other things. I just don't thank God for the church that's there, but everything else, I can't find anything else. Is it different here in Newark and Camden? I didn't think so. So, folks, you want to talk about marginalized populations. If you're in the business of addiction, and this is what it comes down to, if you're in the business of addiction, you have to go after the groups that are going to be feeding your profits. And that mainly is youth, because you find me an addict that started their drug of choice after age 25. Can you find me someone that has? Not really. I mean, the only exception would be if you dislocated your shoulder and you got 100 Oxycontins, and then many people, that's obviously what's happened to them. But by and large, addiction is a pediatric, it starts at a young age. So you go after youth, and I'm going to talk about the youth brain, and you also go after the folks that may not have the access to healthcare, education, and housing to fall back on. The folks in parts of Baltimore that just don't have the luxury that maybe many of us would here to write the $25,000 check to Betty Ford Treatment if something goes wrong for Junior, and find the best lawyer to expunge the record. So you go after, that's why there are 8 times as many liquor stores. So the idea that social justice can somehow be, if only we would legalize another intoxicant. Folks, if it's hard enough for a young black male today to get a job, as it is, do you think employers would say, you know what, I would hire him if only he was smoking marijuana, he'd be a more attractive candidate? Think about that. So it's just ironic, and I'm going off on a tangent a little bit, but I think it's important. It's ironic that when I go to D.C., okay, I don't know how many of you know how D.C. is divided northwest, and it's in 4 quadrants. Well, it's 85% Caucasian, median income $150,000 in northwest, in Georgetown, and southeast average income $17,000, 67% of people on social assistance, and 90% African American. That's the division. Okay, when I go to D.C., when I go to Northwest, I have the guys that, I went to Oxford with, and they're making good money, and they look like me, and they're great. And they're like, we need to legalize for social justice. And what's amazing is that they've never been involved in social justice in their entire life, but, I guess marijuana has awoken them to care about social justice. The people in Southeast, they need this because they're, this is the drug war. And then I go down to Southeast, and they're saying, well, wait a minute. The last thing we want is more drugs in our community. That isn't going to help us with education. That isn't going to help us keep families together. And I just find that is so ironic. And then I'm vilified in Northwest. I like to say they're like, oh, we don't want Kevin here. He's going to give us his anti-marijuana stuff. But in Southeast, they roll out the red carpet for me because they know what the harms have been. And what I see in New Jersey is especially the social justice aspect. And yes, there are more African Americans and Latinos arrested, absolutely. And that's the truth, by the way, for all crimes, not just drug crimes. And we need to get to the bottom of that and address those issues. Legalization, though, isn't going to be a way to address them at all because of the way this industry is going to target us. So let's just talk very quickly. We have had, let me tell you something. If you're a 60-year-old guy smoking a joint in your basement, this discussion is not aimed at you. Okay, and I don't think that you should be doing that, and I certainly don't want you to be my doctor or my pilot or my driver or anything like that because I fly a lot and I don't want. But I am not saying that we need to go after the adults using a joint now and again. Again, I don't think that's a good thing. But my point is, folks, the epidemic that's going on in this country are young people using every week or every day. And the number of young people using every day, like at least 25 days a month, 21 days a month or more, has increased by a factor of 7 since 1992. Since 2000, it's increased by 57%. Those are the numbers that I'm really worried about, because let's think about what that's doing to today's generation. I'm going to skip through some of these other stats to get through. So why should we care about it? My book's up here. I'm going to sign some copies. I think they're going to be raffled, and I go into all the details that I may not have time to go into today. That's in the book. But the first one is that marijuana is harmless and non-addictive, and I do want to touch on that. Right? We've all heard the thing, well, it's not that bad. It's only psychologically addicting, right? We've heard that. It's not physically addicting. It's psychologically. Let me tell you something. That doesn't make sense, that psychological versus physical addiction. That's not a technical term. The brain could care less whether you say it's psychological or physical. Okay, so let me just tell you what addiction is, folks. Addiction means you did something, you liked you did it, you liked that you did it, you remembered that you liked it, and you do it again regardless of the consequences. That's it. It's just as simple. It doesn't need to be put in fancy language. And that can absolutely happen with all kinds of drugs of abuse. And it can definitely happen with marijuana. And we see that happening a lot. And the reason is because the brain, I like to say the brain is very selfish. Regardless of what part of you might think is right, when that brain likes something, it's difficult. It's not impossible. There's 25 million people who are in recovery and are inspirations to everyone. But it's very difficult. And it gets more difficult, folks, when you're under age 25. Why? The easiest way I can put it is that your brain is essentially under construction until age 25. Okay? It actually has some big spurts between ages 6 and 8, big spurts between 13 and 15. Any parent in here can attest to any of that. And the issue with the brain, actually, it's a really great thing, by the way, that the brain is under construction. That's a wonderful thing, because it means that kids can pick up on things. That's when they learn. That's when they're picking up on so many things. When you want to learn a language, is it easier when you're 4 or 40, right? Trust me, Rosetta Stone or not, it's much easier when you are 4. Learning how to swim, not impossible if you're 50, but a lot harder than if you're 5. Right? It's sort of counterintuitive, right? Because we think like, well, kids, they have no coordination. How can they do that? And I'm an adult. I've learned how to coordinate. But actually, no. Your brain is a sponge, is picking things up so easily. And the flip side of the bad news when it comes to that are things that can essentially stay with you your whole life. It's why childhood trauma is a big issue, bigger than, frankly, adult trauma, because it can stay with that person for their entire life. And it's also why drug abuse is a problem when you're young. Because your brain is just forming. It's forming those connections between the different parts of your brain that tell you what you want to do and what you like, and connect things like judgment and memory and vision and those things are vulnerable because they're just forming. And when you have any drug, doesn't matter what it is, enter the system, it has the potential to really affect you a lot more when your brain is forming than when your brain is essentially hardened. Now, doesn't mean that you can't get addicted after 25. Absolutely. But it is much, much easier when you're younger. And marijuana, frankly, unlike tobacco, works on all of these parts of the brain, movement, memory, vision, sensation, judgment, absolutely reward, in a way that's can be very profound for a young person and can be very harmful. And the main reason it can be harmful, and where parents these days, I think, frankly, are sort of out to lunch on this, is that, as Tony was saying, the kind of marijuana, the THC is what gets you high, okay? Marijuana is a very complex plant. It has over 500 components, much more complex than something like opium. It has 500 components. We don't know about most of those things. Like, we just have no clue what they do. But we do know that THC acts on the brain, right? THC actually binds to these little black things in the brain that are cannabinoid receptors. That's what gives you the feelings it does. And the THC has been essentially selectively bred to be increased. So that's why it really is true that this is not your Woodstock weed anymore. This isn't even your, 1990s weed anymore. I was going to make a Bill Clinton reference, but I did just forget that. But this isn't your 1990s weed anymore either, let alone your Woodstock weed, okay? And so I think a lot of parents kind of have this, well, like, I used it in 1973 for 2 years in the dorms, and am I going to be a hypocrite if I talk to my kid? And, what do I tell them the whole thing? And what do I say? I mean, first of all, parents do need to talk to their kids regardless of them using, and they need to talk about, they don't need to go into the gory details of it, but they shouldn't, but they should be upfront and honest and talk about how they thought it was a mistake and how they don't want